Torod, thanks for joining us today. You have been a staunch advocate for diversity, equity, and inclusion during your entire career. And certainly with the murder of George Floyd this spring, there's been a whole new conversation. I'm just curious to get us started today. Do you think this is just a moment or time, or do you think this is a moment where real change will take place?
Thanks, Barbie. It's good to be with you as well and be a part of this discussion. So I think to that first question, I always say this, I am hopeful. And I think this is, I believe, certainly in my career, one of the first times I believe we have the chance to change the narrative around our industry, and not just the narrative, but the fundamental operating reality. And I think we've all seen the consistent angst that my peers, your peers, have all shared and expressed. And I would certainly say that to a person, I believe everyone involved in this discussion is well-meaning. But I think there are few moments in history where the mental, emotional understanding of the weight and significance of a challenge is more present than this issue is present for our industry and in our collective minds than it is today. And so that's what leads me to be optimistic. There's still work to be done, but I really don't think we've ever been at this place of mental alignment, organizational alignment, societal alignment, that it's got to stop. And so that's really what I want to focus on taking advantage of to drive real meaningful change.
Torod, you obviously bring both a personal and a professional perspective to this conversation. What can you share with our global audience today? Of course, around different parts of the world, there are different aspects of the diversity conversation. But at a high level, why in business should we care? Why is it important?
Yeah. It's a great question. And I think, pre-COVID, I traveled a significant amount of time around the world. And even more practically, the global team at Lenovo that I lead is one of the most diverse teams I've ever been responsible for. And then I think even secondarily, the Lenovo business is perhaps the most diverse of an organization that I've been a part of in terms of our customer base, our employee base, the market diversity. But I say the travel point in that, again, pre-COVID, one of the things that it reinforced for me as a business leader, as an operations leader, is the importance of perspectives and people who look like the customers we're trying to influence. It's exciting to travel markets and to be subsumed, as I know you've experienced as well, in cultures that are completely and fundamentally different from the way I grew up, the way I've thought, the way I've learned. And that to me is unbelievably exciting. The dynamism that comes from being in a discussion in a room with people who are bringing perspectives that I would never on my own think about. And this is true, we see that this across race and gender. And we know, obviously, this issue as it relates to women is something that we've done much, much better on. There's still work to do there, but that's an example I think that we've all aligned around, that, of course, we need and want gender diversity because of all that it brings to the table, not just because it's a good thing to do, but because of this richness that is there. And when we remove ourselves from the market or the geography where we sit, where we've grown up, where we've been educated, many of us, and really supplant ourselves in this global society, this global marketplace, it becomes even more intuitive that, well, of course we'd want to ensure that we are benefiting from the most divergent, diverse, different perspectives before we align around the way. And that, I think, in some ways is where the seat I enjoy working in at Lenovo is helpful in that way, because it reinforces all of those things. And I get to see it again outside of the pandemic environment every day in the interactions I have with people, with our customers. And it is one of the most validating things in my life, seeing and experiencing the importance of that diversity of thought, opinion, of people, of collective understandings and insights that you're never going to get to in a monolithic team or organization that is represented by a dominant culture or gender, ethnicity that's the most significant of the day.
I'm glad you mentioned diversity of thought and perspective, because I think we talk a lot about the race aspect, but it's not just that. It's about bringing people across all different facets of our lives to make the work better, right?
Right.
To bring better ideas. Torod, you've been an advocate for agencies. You have famously demanded, really, that agencies show up in a diverse way. How do you think that's going broadly? And what would you say to your peers about putting the same demands out there? Because you really are coming from a position of strength, if you will.
Yeah.
And secondly to that, agencies should be doing it anyway.
Yes, yes. I agree. I think the last point in my mind is one of the more significant points, and I mentioned this a little earlier. I mean, everyone is well-meaning. Again, I've never had a conversation with someone who is oppositional to the importance of these kinds of initiatives. I think for me, and again, this has been a conversation that obviously I've been a part of for almost 30 years now. And 30 years ago, leaders, agencies, and brands were talking about how important this issue was. But I think fundamentally for me, where I've come to in the last several years is this understanding that, rhetorically, we're all aligned. For us to have real meaningful impact on this issue, the last mile, if you will, is probably more than anything a reflection of the will and determination of the leaders of our industry. And for the brands, I believe it is as pedantic as deciding, for those of us who control the pocketbooks, the purses, the wallets, the last mechanism available to us to drive change is using that authority, that leadership, that will to help push. Again, pushing well-meaning people, so not pushing people who are opposed to this, but pushing well-meaning people to drive toward action. And that's really what I was trying to accomplish. And others, there are peers of mine who've certainly stepped in and other brands that are making these same kinds of commitments. But I think fundamentally that's probably one of the last more significant structural system kinds of things that we're going to have to see, again, clients leaning into for there to be real, verifiable, and important change. We know when money's on the table, it helps us all focus. And so this is just one microcosm, one example of an area where that same dynamic, I believe, we are using to force this change in a little more specific and directed way.
Torod, why do you think there's been a lot of talk about bringing people of color into organizations, but why are they so absent from the decision-making roles?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And there's been a ton of research done, certainly from the US perspective. And, I've seen some global research, not as much, obviously. But it's a great question, particularly kind of mid-career question around, we call it pipeline here in the US, which is essentially, getting entry-level talent into our industry across sectors, whether that's agencies, brands, or whatever you might have. And so there are a lot of organizations who have done phenomenal work, around the pipeline issue. And I think, I really believe at the end of the day, pipeline is not the issue. Again, there are always exceptions, places where we could do better, organizations could do better, and certain brands or agencies are challenged around the pipeline. But generally, pipeline is not the issue that I would suggest is the thing that we need to be most focused on. I think from my vantage point, the real challenge we have, to your question, Barbie, is once diverse talent is acquired in our organizations, there's a community, there's an emotional, there is a subconscious, unconscious bias that happens that is really much more pernicious than I think most of us understand. And it's not until leaders, managers, hiring managers in particular, the people that are managing diverse talent when it comes in, have a real understanding of some of these nuances, because it is most often nuances of how you include diverse talent into our organizations. I mean, our country here in the West, has hundreds of years of this, unconscious bias kind of behavior that, again, I fundamentally believe well-meaning people just don't appreciate all that's unpacked within. Similar to, if we spoke a different language, think about how we would have to be cared for in the way that our organizations think about integrating us, bringing us in. It's just so multifaceted. And again, there's work that is happening. Organizations, I think, are really leaning into training, their staffs, their teams, their managers, not just HR, but the organizations overall around some of these things. But it is deep waters. And so I think this is unfortunately a place where when we are focused on just quick fixes or just the numbers, which unfortunately this diversity issue has for many of us become about the numbers. And when we lose sight of these operational, cultural, unconscious bias issues that really go to the fundamental environment that diverse talent is, being recruited to sit within, it minimizes and really avoids us really understanding the kinds of things that I think are necessary, not just for us to create a dynamic culture for diverse talent, but for us to have dynamic organizational cultures. Because I also believe our organizations at large, diverse talent and non, are much more rewarded, much more appreciated, valued, and want to be a part of organizations where a diverse culture, a diverse environment, a diverse people are thriving. For all those things I talked about a little earlier, it's just more exciting to be a part of that kind of organization. I want to come to work every day when I know I'm going to be challenged and I'm going to learn some things. I'm going to get to sit next to someone who can teach me things or help me understand things that I've never known. I think fundamentally our industry is an industry of learners, of very curious people. And I think that's the kind of dynamic that we need to create, retain top talent, and be this organization, this industry that we need to be, that really is about the best, most creative thinking and results, and that are helping our organizations transform themselves, because we represent all that is best and ideal about the stakeholders that we're ultimately trying to influence for our customers and for our businesses as well.
Torod, I want to stick on the inside a little bit. Thinking about our audience today, what would you say to young professionals who are inside an organization, whether it's race or gender or sexual orientation, whatever place on the diversity spectrum they sit, who might be feeling alone or might be feeling that the company that they're working for isn't doing enough? What advice do you have about speaking up and taking some charge and really holding managers and leaders accountable?
Yeah.
This is an important question, I think. And also, I know I found in our own organization that I want people to speak up and teach me as a white person in this case so that we can make change. But I imagine there are people all over the world sitting in jobs who are feeling helpless, or that if they speak up, they're going to lose their job. So what advice do you have for those people?
Yeah, it's another great question. I mean, I think our voices, our collective voices and our individual voices are powerful. And I think we talked about this a little already. I think this moment that we are experiencing is unique. In that, as an industry, as a society, I think we are more aligned now than we ever have been on the importance of these things. And so the importance of diverse voices across that entire spectrum is critical. I appreciate that earlier on, for me, even I recall, some of the earlier conversations starting out in agencies where, I was uncomfortable about, the lack of progress. And it's certainly more challenging when you are not at a certain level where you believe your voice has influence. Although I do think, voices have more influence regardless of things like titles and roles. But that being said, I remember distinct moments where I had to determine, I believe this matters. I don't think my voice has the weight that it should in this organization or at this moment. And And so I remember consciously finding other allies, seeking out other allies. And that may be practically, particularly, for folk who may be more junior or starting out in their career, may be the best kind of initial, on-ramp to engaging, to find allies. And maybe, with the specific focus on allies whose voices may be more influential within our organizations, right? So maybe it's not, some of the account team, or it's not some of the more junior level people in the organization. It's targeting, one of the leaders, one of the managers, one of the directors who either you've heard talk, in a very favorable way about this issue, this cause, or who you believe would be an appropriate advocate for you. Again, I've had many advocates who did not look like me, who were just as passionate about advocating for this issue. And so that process of identifying those people, those voices, those partners that you can commiserate with to make a plan of attack for our organization sometimes is more pragmatic. And certainly, as I have matured in the industry and my voice has been able to garner more weight, I think to your question, the courage to lean in and to bring it up and to raise the questions. I think in this environment, we should be comforted by the fact that there's much more support for this and us, and raising this discussion in our organization. So hopefully there's some encouragement that you get from that. The last thing I'd say, and this is also a conscious decision I recall had to make in my career, there is honestly the point where I think if we're honest with ourselves, some organizations are just not going to be the place for us to thrive. And again, I'm not suggesting that's a day one decision. I think there are a lot of considerations that have to come into that, but I know decisions that I've gotten to where it became very, very clear that this is not the organization or the culture for me and for these values that we are talking about, both because of what I've heard and know the leadership espouses, and because of what I see and understand about how this business operates and behaves. And that, in some ways, is just as important of a decision as raising the discussion and having the conversation that we're talking about. Not every organization is going to be ideal for us and for diverse people, regardless of what diverse part of the spectrum we're talking about. And unfortunately, in some situations, we're going to have to make those tough decisions as well to find ourselves an organization that aligns with the values that we know matter to us and to our larger communities.
I'm glad you mentioned being brave enough, if you will, to walk away from an organization that may not work for you. What would you say to a young person in the interview process? How do you assess, and what are the questions to ask? Again, whether we're talking about race, gender, sexuality, what have you, to see if in fact that is the right place. And is there a time in your career when you just have to tough it out because you want to get in?
Yeah, I think that this is the benefit of the internet, right? In terms of we're able to be much more knowledgeable and informed about a lot of these things beforehand. To the more pragmatic question about, when we're actually in the process of, considering and being considered by an organization, I think that's where listening is key. I mean, I would suggest that, throughout my career, as I've had moments to be in conversations with people, with leaders, whether I was considering working or collaborating or, partnering with an organization or, actually in the interview process, I'd say two things. One, the courage to ask the questions. And generally the questions are about culture and values, right, for organizations. And in many ways, those are very safe and subtle ways to probe. And, in an ideal environment, I would hope that any well-meaning leader who is truly committed to this issue would proactively, weigh in on these topics without a lot of, guidance. And so if I ask you to share with me a bit of how you talk about your organization's culture and what matters to it, its values, and you're looking at me as a diverse person, and if you're not able to articulate something that resonates in that arena, again, these are indicators. I wouldn't suggest that those are the final decision making, but these are all these are proof points. What I've always appreciated in conversations, even before they might get to some more direct discussion of this issue and this cause, particularly when I'm, sitting across the table or the desk from a non-diverse person. I've always appreciated people who on the other side of the table are willing to go there first because they see who I am. That boldness, that courage is an indicator of, okay, this issue may not be solved, and this certainly may not be the poster child of the organization and the leader that's got it, but someone who's willing to put the discussion on the table, in my mind, goes a long way toward the credibility and authority of their voice, right? And so even if in that conversation it is, we're not there yet. But I'll tell you one thing as the leader, that in some ways is just as important as results that you can point to, today. And so I think listening for all of these things, which are indicators, I think at the end of the day, maybe the right answer is we've just got to be much more savvy at listening to what's not said just as much as what's said, and being aware that a lot of times we need to allow people to be forthcoming without necessarily attempting to force the issue on the agenda, because I think we learn more about the authenticity of organizations, people's leaders, by what is not asked, but what is disclosed.
To that point, you mentioned earlier that there has been a lot of discussion on the numbers. And one of the things I thought a lot about is it's not great. And let's just say what it is. And, someone else had said to me, it's not a blame and shame game. Again, whatever part of diversity we're talking about.
Right.
So what would you say to agencies or companies who are not as forthcoming, perhaps, to their current status?
Yeah.
Because the numbers aren't good. And so they're not releasing them. But I think there is something to be said. We're all in this together. The numbers aren't great, but we need to take action. How important do you think it is for organizations to be very open about where they are today, even if it's not good?
Yeah. I mean, I think numbers have their place, and I would certainly not suggest that numbers are the only indicator, but they matter, but they are not the only thing that we need to care for. And back to this last conversation around this authentic conversation around understanding who we are. I believe part of making progress in any area is having the unvarnished truth about, okay, so where are we starting from? And that's certainly, I think, what our industry has seen, experienced in the last 6-7 months, however long it's been, where most have, publicly talked about their performance data and, disclosed either at a holding company level if they're, part of a big holding company, or even the independents as well. In some ways, the independents have been more forthcoming about these things. But I think that matters. But I think, we talked about this a little earlier, the numbers are important. And I think the leader, whether that's admitting they're not what they need to be, but here's what I'm going to do, is just important. Again, because I think talent, not just diverse talent always appreciates an honest, upfront leader. Because like we often counsel our peers and, clients, the people you're engaging, they know the truth, right? Whether your silence is an admission of that or whether you publicly disclose it, the truth is largely known. There are very few things that we discover these days that are really aha moments. We may be aha by the specific data, but the underlying reality is seldom surprising. Because, and so it's funny. It's the equivalent of, I think often I have a 16-year-old who we have these conversations around his grades, and he would love to convince me that the grades are not the only reflection of his performance in the class. And so I think this diversity conversation can be a little bit like that. Oh, okay, I'll give you half of that discussion, I understand. But fundamentally, your evaluation is going to be driven most significantly, and the degree to which you're improving is going to be driven by, that A versus that B. And so I think that's also a microcosm of this same discussion. The last point I think that is key to this conversation around admitting where we are so that we can clearly understand what we need to do to get better is I do believe at its core and its most fundamental place, this issue is about leadership. And it's about the leadership of our organizations and whether we have the strength and the sheer will to lean in, okay, not to solve it tomorrow, but to commit to. Because again, I've spent time on agency side and I've been on the brand side, both about half my career in each. On the agency side, I know I've been a part of leadership decisions where someone who wasn't generating revenue or couldn't drive client satisfaction for more than, maybe you got one or two chances, but there is that point where, you know what, we need to cut our losses. Because the fundamental value you are bringing to the priorities of this organization, again, whether that was client growth, client retention, revenue growth, revenue retention, again, we're all in it about making money. When leaders fail to deliver that, we got to move on. On the brand side, you know, I've been a part of and advocate for, we've got to upgrade our talent. We've got to have the right butts and seats. And that means butts and seats that are helping us drive our strategy, drive the organization forward, transform our discipline. And when it's clear that there are leaders in organizations' mind who have not been committed to that, we have to go in a different direction. And we need to look at different talent, different people. We need to make tough decisions. So if you back up to the last 6 or 7 months where we have all across the industry talked about this as a collective priority for us. This matters just as much as all of the more significant business indicators that we, you know, KPI ourselves on at this point. If that is true, why are we not bringing the same discipline and rigor to our leadership decision-making that we do, again, from an agency perspective around growing business, client business, and from a brand perspective that we do around, are these the right people in my organization who are delivering on the priorities that I have as the leader? So if D&I is a priority of mine, then you better believe it better be a priority for my leadership team. Just like these other mechanisms that we talk about. And I think that's what I mentioned when I suggest that at the end of the day, it's a fundamental leadership challenge, and it's an alignment challenge for us around our values and our actions. Because our teams see, again, for agencies, they see us, you know, firing talent that is not helping us grow business revenue. I would actually not have an issue with understanding this is the reality of the business. But has that ever happened on the brand side or an agency side because someone did not commit to meaningful diversity, recruitment, retention, staffing efforts? And that's this alignment of our values and our actions that I think we have to get to as well.
I think that's a great point to close on. For people in our audience who are at all different points of their career, what I would say, yes, it is a leadership issue, but it's for all of us at every level of the organization. I think all of our people need to understand it's a priority and be able to say, this is what I'm going to do to help advance that. And to this, my last question, something I think about and I'm cognizant of, when the next big thing comes along, and it will, I certainly hope the rigor and the intensity around diversity, equity, inclusion today does not move away. Because you and I both know we're in a news cycle where the next story is going to hit and we're all going to be swept up in that. So in closing, Torod, what do we say to our audience about not letting this become, well, it's off the news, we'll just put it, no one's paying attention, we'll just wait till something else happens? Like, how do we make this always the top of the agenda?
Yeah, I think the consistent use of our voices is one point, you know, we talked about a little earlier in terms of ensuring that we continue to hold our leaders accountable, all of us, right, regardless of our level where we sit within our organizations. I think that falls to us. And this is, again, back to that leadership challenge opportunity that exists for us. I think it's also a place where, to your point, the next thing is going to happen if it's not already happened in some market around the world. And so I think at the end of the day, that's going to be the moment where it becomes clear whether we are truly committed to this or not. And where those of us who believe that this needs to be ongoing and sustained are going to have to perhaps be even more vocal in our organizations when we see that reality happening, if and when it does. And this is where I think we have to, again, use our voices to ensure that we don't lose this momentum and that this issue doesn't lose the stature and the momentum that it's gained over the last 8 or 9 months, because this issue for our organization is not going to go away. It may go away as a top line discussion item, but the fundamental issues we're talking about within our organizations, retaining, recruiting top talent, creating the cultures that allow us to win and to compete in the marketplaces we are competing in, which are fiercely competitive for creative ideas and thinking and talent, are not going to get less so. And so we've got to align around this issue, because I think it's one of the more significant levers we have to influence how we compete and thrive and win. And that's ultimately what we're all trying to do.
And I think when we look at this diversity, equity, inclusion, not just in a silo, but as a way to impact so much of what we do, I think that's when we'll really not lose sight of its importance. Yeah. Torod, thank you so much. You bring so much of your personal and professional self. I'm sure our audience has taken some good insights away that they can apply in their own work and their own lives in various parts of the world. So thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Barby, for the time. This was a great discussion.
Hello, everyone. It's great to be here live with you from New York and Torod in North Carolina. Torod, thank you for that great discussion, really insightful, and I'm delighted to see so many questions here in the chat. So let's get started with some of them. Our first question is from Ashleisha Raj. What are a few key mistakes that should be avoided while promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace amid the changing times today? I think that's a great place to start.
Yeah, it is a great question. I'd actually be interested in some of your thoughts as well. But I think for me, 2 things stand out, and I'm sure this is a conversation that's probably already happened throughout the conference. But I'd say the authenticity of an organization's influence in this discussion is directly proportionate with, again, the amount of work that's been put in. And I think it's one of the things that I talk about quite often in terms of the role that communications leaders play, which is connecting who we aspire to be as organizations, our brand aspiration, our corporate or our entity's aspiration, with the reality of who we are in its most authentic and honest sense. And the role for communications leaders is really to manage that continuum. And so to this question, I think where we have to be careful, not just as advisors, counselors to our organizations, but also as leaders who have an interest, a passion about this issue, is to ensure that we balance that, desire to see change, to be influencers of change, with an understanding of the reality of where we come from. And so I think we've got to speak about this issue in a way that's authentic to who we are and honest. Right? I think the other thing that we sometimes minimize that our stakeholders appreciate is honesty. And it doesn't always have to be through the lens of, look at us, we've solved this problem. In many instances, we miss the value of engaging in a direct, honest, authentic, transparent way. And if we've done the work around building our reputation, building allies, we can benefit from that honesty. And that's one of the things I would caution all of us to be much more thoughtful about. A mistake is leaning in heavier than the credibility of your story.
I think those are great points. I would add just a couple more. I'll actually quote something, Torod, that you have said, and that is, we cannot market our way out of an issue with diversity, equity, inclusion, whether we're talking gender, race, sexuality, what have you. And I would also say that words are fine, but I think the mistakes that organizations make is they say a lot, but what are they actually doing? What are the actions that are being taken? And lastly, it's not just the responsibility of the CEO. I think if the leadership does not bring the entire organization along, I think it's going to be really hard to make sustainable change.
Yeah, great points.
Okay, second question from Chizuk Lonkumer, and forgive me if I'm not getting the names right, but I do want to make a personal connection here virtually. Really good question here. If a company admits to where they are and their need for improvement, how can they reduce the backlash or negative response from consumers?
Yeah, it's another great question. I think one of the things I would say, and again, this is back to an understanding of the role that strategic comms, reputation, marketing leaders play. I mean, fundamentally, it's about building relationships, building allies, influencing the stakeholders, regardless of where they sit or what they look like or what they represent. Influencing and building relationships with them. So if we've done the work, again, to this last question of not coming at this with the view of managing it today based on a perspective that's grounded in today, but we've done the work to build a community of allies, supportive stakeholders, a community that is supportive to our organizations, then when there's a moment, whether it be around DE&I or anything else, that's where, again, the value of having done this work is much more significant. And so I think that's probably one of the bigger areas in my mind in terms of managing backlash. I see a big part of the work that we're driving as a brand to ensure that we are inoculating ourselves from that thing that will happen in the future. And we know it will happen. We just don't know what it will be. But we're investing in these relationships and these communities and our stakeholders to buy ourselves. Again, one of the metrics that we track real time at Lenovo around something that we call the benefit of the doubt. So we track benefit of the doubt because that is a clear data informed indicator of when the thing happens, how likely are our publics, our audiences to stick with us or give us the time to fix the problem or to address it or to stay with us while we as an organization in all transparency admit we have work to do, but that we need them to stay engaged with us. And so that long-term kind of proactive relationship community building aspect of our roles is even more important when you think about mitigating or avoiding or backlash in the sense that I think this question is asking.
And I also think just this sense of humility that we may not have solved it all and we may not be perfect, but we are taking the steps along the way. Okay, question 3 from Kushi Rawat. Again, I hope I got that right. It is important for brands to take a stand on issues and movements regarding diversity, equity, inclusion. How can they do so without hijacking the movement and shifting the focus from the people who are at the center of the conversation?
Yeah.
That's a good one.
That's another great question. Yes. And so I think, and again, this is one where I think, Barbara, you may have more insight just given your client experience there. But from my vantage point, I think where brands have to be careful is not being so heavy-handed in the way we engage in a conversation. The way to, because we've all seen it go wrong, right? We've all seen it done poorly, where an organization, just because it has the money, the resources, and is determined they're going to buy advertising at a moment or a place or whatever it might be, determined they're going to engage. But I'd say ultimately the discipline that's important here is, again, one of the things that we've been talking about across even the first 2 questions here that we've entertained is the way to thoughtfully engage in a conversation around which a brand can be a part. Again, assuming we've done the work and we have the credibility and authority to weigh in on a topic. I think this process of being thoughtful, being data informed about the most authentic way to do that is a discipline, again, that all brands don't have, but I think we need to increasingly employ before we lean in just because we have the budget resources or the ability to do that. I think we can calibrate that by, again, using data much more that we have available to us today to understand what opportunity we have as a brand, as an organization. The white space, sometimes we talk about it in terms of, let's look at the macro conversation that's happening around any one issue. And then secondarily, which is just as important as understanding the conversation that's taking place, is understanding where is there an authentic on-ramp for us to engage in this discussion in a way that's very authentic and emotive and connective and accretive. And that, again, that discipline is not easy, but when it's done well, it is a compelling thing to see. But I do think oftentimes it is not the way that many of us think about, again, marketing ourselves into something that will give us a moment to be seen and heard, unfortunately.
I think this idea of authenticity is so important. And I think a brand needs to be sure that they're not engaging to put the spotlight on them. I think a brand has to be willing to do it because it's the right thing to do, to engage in the conversation because it aligns with their broader purpose. I think on one hand, it's about being authentic, and it is definitely not about being opportunistic in the moment. I think brands and companies have to be very comfortable in saying, we're doing this because it's the right thing, whether we get noticed or not. I think the employees of the company will notice what's being done, and that is also an important filter to be put through, because these are not moments for marketing. These are moments to come together and take a stand, chiefly because it's the right thing to do. And that does take discipline. And, as an agency person, it does require us as counselors to our clients to say, actually, that's not the way to engage. That doesn't feel authentic. So I think those are really important conversations, but it is about, does this brand or company have a foundation that leads them into the conversation versus having it be episodic?
Yeah.
Okay, question from Salanga Chakraporty. How do you make concepts like diversity, equity, and inclusion palatable in a country where casteism remains ingrained in the collective psyche of its population? That is such an interesting question. Torod, I'll let you go first.
It's an interesting question that probably is going to take longer than 10 minutes to answer, but it is a great question. The reality is, unfortunately, regardless of where we sit in the world, we are all residing or trying to influence or practice our craft in markets that have some ingrained cultural realities that run counter to this conversation that we're having. So whether it's casteism in this in this part of the world that we are focused on today, again, some of us who sit with global remits, again, can look across multiple countries and see whether that's the racism challenges here in the West. So again, it's a multifaceted question, but I think in some ways I'd suggest back to the last one or two questions that we've been discussing. This is where having a real finger on the pulse of the conversations, the reality, the insight into what's happening in your marketplace, not just the conversation itself, the reality of some of these dialogues, but understanding where the opportunity lies, if there is one, for us to engage as brands, as organizations, as entities in a discussion in a very authentic, transparent way, and add weight. Again, I think in some ways, this point Barbie made at the end of this last question around the consideration around, just because we have a voice doesn't mean we should use it. We're all obviously passionate about many of these issues, again, regardless of where we sit. But the discipline sometimes to ask ourselves in a very strategic and honest way, is our voice going to add something to this discussion? Even though we're passionate about it, our leadership may be passionate, our CEO may be passionate, are we going to help move this conversation along? Or will we be a distraction? And so that discipline, I think, and this is where data is our friend, because we can be much more informed and intelligent about these questions before we decide one way or the other. But that rigor is even more important because of the emotional, ingrained nature of these topics that we're talking about.
I would just add, I think this is a tough one, because we are, like racism in the United States, we are dealing with forces and systems that have been in place for hundreds upon hundreds of years. I guess the only thing I would add is that this ongoing conversation, continuing to talk about it and figuring it out, the steps that we can take and giving ourselves a break in terms of we're not going to solve this next month. I think we as communicators and marketers, we see a problem, we come up with an idea, and we're there. I think this requires us to be disciplined, as you said, strategic, and say, what are the steps that are going to see change in increments of time, 3, 6, 9 months, 12, 24. And to an earlier point you made, Torod, getting those early allies, on our side to begin to influence early adopters to, make change. We've certainly seen this year the power of the younger people, as we call Gen Z, the 20-something, and the power of their platforms. And I think we call them Gen Disrupted at Zeno, but I think they have a really important part to play in terms of advocating for and making real change.
Yes.
And I think, just as you talk about often, Torod, sheer will and determination to make change. That, I think, is a really important part of all of this.
Yes. Yeah, I agree.
Okay, we have 3 minutes to go, so I think this might be the last question from Needy Verma. And the question is, while a lot of brands are hijacking the purpose-driven strategy with the superficial intent of following the trend, so such an important insight there, how do genuine marketers stay afloat and prove their salience in the eyes of consumers? And I think that, Torod, is a really good question to maybe wrap everything up that we've been discussing over the last several days.
Right. I'd say, again, one of the things, I think, Barbie, you mentioned this earlier on in the conversation, this concept that I often raise, that we can't market ourselves out of some of these conversations and some of these challenges. I think, again, I go back to, this is where credible, authentic storytelling and all the things we've talked about that are underneath credible and authentic matter. And I think for organizations who are using this disciplined way to think about how do we align who we are at our core, who we are in reality, with our desire to engage in this topic, this conversation, this movement, that process, that discipline, that rigor at the end of the day is going to help us address the risk that I think is inherent in this question, which is the desire just to market and attach ourselves to something emotional that's going to create a moment, that marketers often look for, versus a meaningful, impactful, accretive engagement in a dialogue that's going to change or move a conversation along. And so I think the assumption being, if we're on that end of authenticity and transparency, and we have a compelling story that's validated by the way our organizations operate and behave, then that's a much easier consideration for us versus I think those of us who are perhaps not attached to organizations that have that credibility and authority. And often times the best value we can bring to organizations is avoiding doing something that's going to be damaging. Just because you have the ability or you have the resources or you have the people to do something doesn't mean we should. And sometimes we have to be those people in our organizations as well, raising our hand and going, you know what, we should not do this even though we can for all these reasons.
Yeah, great. I would just close here by saying, a brand or company being superficial will not lead to sustainable change. And I also think that a brand or company needs to first believe that they have a role that goes beyond the products and services they sell, and that they have a real purpose. And I think if we start there, from there we can understand the role and how they will use their voice.
Yeah.
So I think if I'm reading the clock right, we are just about at the end. So Torod, I want to thank you for sharing your insights personally and professionally. I want to thank the organizers of SPECTRA and Reputation today. It's been a real honor to participate, and I hope that soon we can do this in person. But let's all continue this discussion and continue the path we're on for achieving real diversity, equity, and inclusion together all over the world. So thank you.
Thanks, Barbie. It's a great discussion.